sometimes you're fine when you're not taking 6 or plus classes, and then the first semester you do it when you realize it's like, wait a minute, what worked for me in the past is no longer working and I need to readjust. So yeah. Okay, so a couple of things I want to mention, or a few announcements I want to make at the top of the class. As I'm grading stuff, like I graded those, what does it mean to be an American and what does the American dream mean to me assignments that your previous professor had given you all. Everybody got full credit, although it is clear in that assignment, those of you who are more long-winded and those of you who are like straight to the point, one sentence. um, but that was, it was really interesting to hear those. It tells me a little bit about you, and I was happy to see that most of you would consider me a citizen, an American citizen. So that was really cool to read. Actually, it was a good assignment. So as your grades start developing in the grade book, right, if you have any questions, you want to make sure and come talk to me. I didn't notice any big problems so far. Anybody that didn't submit that first discussion board post should have gotten a comment in the grade book from me saying you can turn it in. I will take it. And I really do mean I will take it, right? It was the first assignment in this class, and in a new format for the course. So you don't even need to give me a reason why you didn't submit it. Just submit it and I'll take it. You guys actually did better than my upper division course in terms of your answers to the discussion board posts. So what most of you did in those discussion board posts worked. Keep doing that. That's the kind of complete answers that I want in those. And really, if you're coming to class and keeping up with the reading, hopefully it's coming out easy, right? So hopefully it feels easy. And if not, that's something where even just a quick chat with me after class can help a lot. Are there any questions about grades or any of that? No, okay, then let's get started, because I do want to talk about the reading, but I want to get to that after, because in terms of the chronological order, it comes after Reconstruction, the Tuskegee syphilis study, but we have to kind of end the Civil War and get to why Reconstruction is so key, and why I said what historians now argue is that Reconstruction was really the key in understanding the development of a Jim Crow system in the American South after the Civil War. This explains really modern day race relations, because things could have gone in a totally different way at the end of the Civil War, and we would be living in a potentially very different world today. But what happens at the end of the war is, of course, Lincoln is assassinated, right? Lincoln had a Reconstruction plan, a plan for how to integrate newly freed people into society and into the economy of the South. Those things were going to be key, really, in terms of what happened afterwards, right? What do you have with all of these people that were enslaved before, and where do they fit in, right? Lincoln had a plan. Radical Republicans in Congress had a plan. In the meantime, the South, the seceding states are occupied by the Union Army, right? It's a military occupation of the South. And this is where the ideas, romantic ideas about the American South develop. This idea of the South as a victim develops with some of the treatment of some of the Southern cities, and then with the military occupation of it, where a lot of Southern families have a family history of how terrible that was, right? And it probably was for them, because a lot of families lost a lot of wealth, but that wealth was in the form of slaves, right? That equaled wealth that they just they had suddenly lost, right? You had 4 million people, though, now that are no longer property, right? what is going to be done with them, especially now that Lincoln has been assassinated. We have a new president, and his plan, or he does not agree with the radical Republican plan in Congress on what to do with the newly freed people. Right? The plan had originally been for the newly confiscated land, right? That the Union Army had confiscated land, for that land to be distributed to formerly enslaved people. Right. This is where the 40 acres and a mule come in. People were supposed to get kind of a form of reparations for slavery, and get something with which to form the basis of a new freed life. Turns out Johnson comes in and all those plans are going to be thrown out, right? The new state constitution, so every seceding state had to write a new constitution, one in which no slavery existed, and one in which they restructured their state. And no state constitution offered anything other than emancipation for newly freed people. Like nothing in these new state constitutions told, or they had no plan, no organization, no way of guaranteeing that the rights of these newly freed people would not be violated. And it seems to be very clear that they didn't want to guarantee those rights, right? They really wanted things to remain as close to what they had been as they were before. Now, the federal government did realize, like, okay, even if you don't give people 40 acres and a mule, you have to do something. Right? People are going to need help finding jobs. Remember that enslaved people could not read and write, like it was illegal for them to read and write. So how are these newly freed people supposed to engage in trade? How are they supposed to negotiate wages? How are they supposed to know what kind of contracts they're signing, or what kind of offers they might even have for a better life when they can't even read and write, right? So initially, what is organized to help people is the Freedmen's Bureau, right? Is this federal program in which the federal government hired people to basically act as intermediaries between newly freed people and the Southern economy, right? They're supposed to help them figure out how to find housing, how to find jobs, and really whatever was needed. Initially, the Freedmen's Bureau is actually trying to do its job. Right? It's very difficult because you have millions of people now trying to restructure their lives. But one of the things that it ends up being used as by these newly freed people is also as an intermediary to find family members. That was one of the main concerns for newly freed people was, what about my dad who was sold to a different plantation, who was sold to a different state? What about my children who I was separated from? All family relations were trying to find each other. But with the chaos of the Civil War, what ends up happening is most people don't end up finding family members. And that's actually why a lot of people stay in the South. Although a lot of people, this is the point at which a lot of people leave. A lot of people leave, but others stay. Because they might not know where to go. They might not have family anywhere else, or a method of transportation. They don't have the money to do it. And they're hoping that by staying put, that family that had been sold away would be able to find them. At the same time, you have this military occupation and total reorganization of the South's political, economic, and social system. Right? We have to figure out how the South's economy is going to function without slavery. And mainly, they have to pay for labor. But most newly freed people didn't want to continue working on plantations. That was work that they had been forced to do via enslavement. And so most people didn't want to do it. And yet, because of the system of slavery, there were no other skills that they might have to do something else. Some did. Some slaves had been trained in a particular trade, could do specialized work. And a lot of those people would leave to urban areas, to cities. But for the rest, there wasn't a whole lot of options, especially without the government giving people land or any kind of money, right? If you're starting from zero, how do you get started? You really literally have nothing, right? So very quickly, during this time, there was at least this attempt via the Freedmen's Bureau to do something about it, right? This is also the period in which there were educated free Black people who began organizing politically, right? Because now there's a free Black population that can vote, can participate and have some electoral power. And so this is the period in time immediately after the Civil War in which we have the most Black representation in Congress. Men get elected to serve as congressmen, to serve in the Senate, right? It is still a really big deal today whenever there is a Black senator elected to the Senate, to the US Senate. Still is, because the only previous time in which there have been more than one or two senators elected to the US Senate was during this period of Reconstruction. Right? When people were allowed to vote, they took the right to vote, and they voted for Black representatives. Right? So there's this moment, there's window immediately after the Civil War of hope, right? Of hope. Let me stop this, and I'm going to play a video. So it's not the one I have linked here, because this one, it turns out we lost access to, but I have a different video from YouTube that talks about this moment at the end of the Civil War of Reconstruction, and how we go from hope to Jim Crow, right? And the establishment of legal segregation and legal racism. So I'm gonna play a short clip. It won't be very long, but it's gonna talk a little bit about that. So let me know. You should be able to hear, but if you can't hear, let me know and I will fix the settings. So let's see. Let me do this.
Well, look at the wallpaper.
Yeah, that's right.
Newspapers and magazines.
That's right. They were only given what were called promissory titles, not permanent titles, but they expected to receive clear and free title to the land down the road.
But the former slaves never did get their titles. Less than a year later, Lincoln was dead. His successor, Andrew Johnson, began to dismantle the plan for Reconstruction, starting with 40 acres and a mule. All confiscated lands were returned to their former owners. For African Americans, President Johnson's order was a crushing disappointment. Still, they had little choice but to keep going, placing their hopes in a reconstructed South.
It's something I wonder about and think, Jesus, how could you...
That's right.
How could you survive every day and have hope, build a family, fall in
That's
love?
right. That's right. And I guess that's all you have is hope, right? Hope did, in fact, bring these people through, and it gave them a firm foundation upon which to visualize their future.
If hope was to be the foundation of the former slaves' new lives, love and family would be its brick and mortar.
Thousands of people have lost their kin, and thousands of people are very keen to find members, family members, and friends who have been sold away.
In freedom, they set out to rebuild families shattered by slavery. They filled newspapers with information wanted ads, seeking long-lost family members.
The ads capture the loss that slavery brought in terms of having your child torn from your arms. There would not be as many reunions as there had been separations, but it didn't stop people from yearning and trying to imagine what that babe of 4 months old looked like 20 years hence. How had your child fared?
Freedom promised a future where Black women and men would have control over their most fundamental decisions. They got married, they took new names, and they worshiped freely in their own churches. For the first time, African American women and men could define the terms of their family's labor.
A Black mother could say, I will not stay overnight anymore, and my 10-year-old daughter who comes to work with me every day will now be going to school for 3 months. And when she is not in school, she won't be coming here with me. It meant reclaiming your right as a human being.
The social changes former slaves experienced were not matched by economic progress. One aspect of Southern society remained fixed. Old King Cotton still reigned. Without land of their own, many freed slaves went back to work on cotton plantations, some for their former masters, who did their utmost to impose poor wages and working conditions. But once in a great while, a freed slave seized a chance for something more. One such man was Benjamin Montgomery, who had been the favored slave at the Davis Bend plantation, the crown jewel of Mississippi's planter aristocracy.
Benjamin Montgomery purchased this land. He purchased it from his former slave owner, Joseph Davis. Joseph Davis, the brother of the president of the Confederacy.
When Union forces closed in, Joseph Davis had fled the plantation. After the war ended, the elderly Davis made a bold and surprising choice. He gave his former slave a loan to buy the property that he and his brother Jefferson once shared. These brick columns are all that remain of the house that Jeff built. Standing here, I try to picture what it was like in Davis's heyday. A rambling 8-room home with a front and back porch from which dozens of slaves could be seen tilling the soil. Now, one of them, Benjamin Montgomery, owned the home built by the President of the Confederacy. And soon, he began to recruit his fellow former slaves to join him at Davis Bend.
He would rent out the land to them, and together they would build a successful cotton crop that would ultimately bring profits to all of them.
And profit they did.
In 1870, Benjamin Montgomery was the third largest cotton planter in the state of Mississippi.
And that's a lot of cotton.
Right. And Mississippi, of course, is the largest producer in the country. So that makes him arguably the third largest planter in the country at that time. It was not just the quantity of cotton, it was also the quality of it. He was winning awards left and right. And he was widely regarded and widely respected by fellow Mississippi planters, most of whom are white.
If this were a Spike Lee film, the Ku Klux Klan would have come galloping down that hill through the river valley,
Yeah.
roasted Benjamin Montgomery and his new plantation.
Right.
But that didn't happen. Why not?
Local white Southerners and white planters in particular were willing to allow him to carry on with his economic activities as long as he stayed out of the limelight, or at least that was his perception. He's doing a lot of work culturally and socially to kind of keep people happy with him, white people in particular.
Montgomery was playing a delicate and dangerous game. appeasing whites so he could continue to profit from his land. It was a gamble, but it was paying off. Ultimately, African Americans knew if they were going to protect and extend the freedoms they had gained in the South, they couldn't depend on the largesse of whites. They needed political power of their own. To get it, they needed the right to vote.
African Americans were very, very sensitive and great. In a sense, historians, they understood that this social revolution should be a revolution about equality under the law for all people. If you're African American and you have the vote, you have a voice, you have a public voice that whites had long sought to suppress.
Their struggle for the vote took place in a larger political context. Northern Republicans feared that the freed African American population might play into the hands of their enemies, the Southern Democrats.
The 3/5 clause, which was the formula used for determining how many congressmen any state was entitled to, that was over with now. And so rather than 3/5 of the slaves being counted, now it was the total free population. And so that really was a political boon to the South, and it would have been used against the North.
But if African Americans were given the vote, they could create alliances with Northern Republicans to forge an unstoppable political force. The Republican-controlled Congress grabbed the chance, passing the 14th Amendment, granting full citizenship and equal protection under the law to anyone born in the United States, regardless of race. And in the 15th Amendment, they gave black men the right to vote.
For the first time, blacks in many communities did have equal representation. You had black legislators in Mississippi, in Alabama, in South Carolina.
Even South Carolina, the state that fired the first shots in the Civil War, saw black men, former slaves, elected to office. One of them was Robert Smalls, the same man who had narrowly escaped from slavery on a boat in Charleston Harbor. In 1868, Smalls was elected by the voters of Beaufort County to the South Carolina House of Representatives. All told, some 2,000 African Americans would hold office between 1868 and 1876. There were sheriffs, justices of the peace, even mayors. The first African Americans would be elected to the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. These politicians promised to use the Reconstruction period to transform the South, politically, economically, and socially.
This would have demonstrated, I think, the virtually unlimited possibilities of the future.
But the transfer of political power in the South triggered a violent backlash among whites who saw their way of life threatened. The small window of opportunity for freed Southern blacks was slammed shut as all levels of white society reacted. Utah, Alabama. Southern Democrats assault a rally of black and white Republicans. 4 black men murdered. Colfax, Louisiana. 300 armed white men attack African Americans over the contested outcome of the local election. 100 black men massacred.
What's happening during Reconstruction is the possibilities, right, of racial equality are emerging. Black people become a threat to, white supremacy.
Most Southern whites could not envision a society in which blacks had rights, in which blacks were treated as humans. They just assumed that black supremacy would replace white supremacy. It would be one or the other. And that fueled their desire to do anything possible to prevent that from happening.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there with the link. If anybody's interested in continuing to go to look at it, it's on YouTube. You know, the quality's a bit iffy, but it's viewable. But that question is really important. Why in this moment of like hope of a completely different racial structure in the United States, why would white Southerners react with violence to put a stop to it? Because that's what the documentary is explaining there, that there is violent reaction to African Americans having political power and to a restructuring of their society, right? Why else? Why would Southern whites react in this way to this moment?
Like they said in the video, a lot of them assumed that white supremacy would be replaced by black supremacy, and I think that when people get in that hierarchical mindset, they have trouble getting out of it.
Yeah, and it does come down to that hierarchy, right? They think, wait a minute, whiteness, meaning me, is I'm at the top of this hierarchy, and all of a sudden, right, this hierarchy they fear is gonna flip around. And that wasn't based on a lot of reality. Like Black people were not talking about restricting the lives of white Southerners, but white Southerners felt like that's what was going to happen. So it was not based on strong evidence, but seeing people that are supposed to be at the bottom of the hierarchy gain political power, gain social power, that was seen as a threat. That was seen as a threat. Can you think about what other elements played a role here? Why are the white Southerners reacting so violently against this moment of hope for equality? What some scholars would say is the capitalist model, right? So some of it might be the racial hierarchy, what some scholars will argue. Some scholars will argue the economic model is just as, some scholars would say more important, because they are losing profit, right? When you have to pay your labor, you're losing profit. And so that it's the drive for economic power to make more money and not lose the money that they've been making is also driving these people. That I think does explain some of it. It especially explains some of the behavior from the planter class, but it doesn't fully explain why poor white Southerners will also participate in maintaining this racial hierarchy, right? Because poor white Southerners would not necessarily benefit from the system of racial segregation, except that it does place them higher than African Americans within a racial hierarchy. So I just want you to think about, as you're reading and seeing evidence of what, that scholars make different arguments about what's more important, this racial hierarchy or this economic aspect. In the end, for me personally, they work together, right? The Southern economy is tied to a racial hierarchy. And if you change one, then you're changing the other. And that just, that is too much of a shock for people, right? Your place in society, everybody's place in society is kind of based on where other people fall in their place in society as well. And so when that starts shifting, there is this fear that you will lose out, right? Do I see somebody? Do I see somebody raising their hand? No. Something popped up. Okay, never mind. So let me go back to this. So economically, right? What we end up happening, let me go back to the PowerPoint, is people getting stuck doing sharecropping, right? So like the video talked about, most formerly enslaved people end up staying, and actually a lot of them work in the same plantations in which they had been enslaved. But when Reconstruction ends and military occupation of the South ends, right, because this whole time, immediately after the Civil War, Southern politicians, well, white Southern politicians are demanding the end of Reconstruction. They want the federal government to leave the states, the Southern states, and to take the military with them. And they want a chance to reestablish society on their own without being forced to do things by the federal government. They negotiate that, and Reconstruction ends. Right? Military occupation of the South ends. And without the military there, without the federal government making sure that the 14th and 15th Amendment are held up, what you end up getting then is a system of Jim Crow and an economic system of sharecropping. Can anybody give us a short explanation of what sharecropping is? What is?
Is the land, the owner give the land and the tools, and the people plant, and after when there is the plantation grows, they share and have in one part.
Yeah, so that's a very basic explanation. Yeah, so let's, like my example here, I'm going to use Olavo, since you spoke up, I'm going to use you as the example. Let's say I am the plantation owner. You all were my enslaved people, and now slavery has ended, but I still have all of this crop that needs to be planted and that needs to be harvested, all this land that is here, and I can't do it on my own. So I need to hire people to do it. So sometimes what the planters begin doing is offer formerly enslaved people a chunk of land. Well, they say, I'll give you this chunk of land. You can build a house there. You can do your own farming there. But in exchange, you're going to have, or you will work part of my land, my crop, and plant and harvest part of it. And this sounds great. At the beginning, it sounds great. I'll get my own piece of land, and I will have work, and everything will be great. But then what ends up happening is that, all right, newly freed people, in order to build your own house in this chunk of land, in order to have access to the land, in order to have the tools to farm, you need things. You need the tools, you need some initial capital, some money to start this new life. So, okay, the planter, I will say, okay, you all need all of this. I will help you out. I will loan you money. I will loan you money so that you can slowly pay me for this land, and eventually it'll be yours. I will loan you money so you can buy the material to build your house, and I will loan you money for the tools you would need to farm on the small chunk of land. And then you can use those tools to also help me, to work on the rest of the plantation and do the planting and harvesting. That might be great, and it could work like the example that the documentary showed, when people were fair. But most planters were not fair, right? And so if in the example, if I'm the planter, what I would say is, all right, I'm going to sell you this equipment, these tools that you need, because I have them. I can sell them to you, but at double the usual price, triple the usual price. Are you going to take me up on that deal?
That's not good.
It is not a good deal, but for a lot of newly freed people, that was their only chance. Who else was going to loan them money? When they were slaves before, so they don't have any other job at the time, no other source of income. So what bank or what other person is going to be willing to take the risk and loan out the money? unlikely. Or a different planter might be offering, but they might be offering a worse deal. On top of it, all of these loans had to be paid back on interest. And what that system ends up doing is guaranteeing that people stay on the plantation. Because oftentimes, the person who originally took out the loan for the land, for the material, for the tools, could not pay it back within their lifetime. And then their children would take over the loan with the hope that this land will be theirs. And then they are now stuck for 2 generations. For the second generation, post-slavery, financially stuck on a plantation. And maybe you can try to run away, but now you're part of this economic system, right? And the person you owe money to can get you arrested for not paying. And if you do that, you will get caught because people went out and caught people that owed money. And now you're going to spend the rest of your life in jail. Or sometimes they would give the option, go back to sharecropping. And so you just end up then with generations of people financially stuck here, right? And add on top of it, a system of Jim Crow that is going to create completely separate schools. So, okay, you might think maybe my kids can get out of this. I will make sure they have an education. Well, you can't send them to school with the white kids. You're going to send them to a different school for Black kids, where the standards are lower, or the training for the teachers is not a good. When the school's packed and they might not even have enough tools to do teaching. And on top of it, the family, because they're owing more and more money, is constantly needing more money, might need the children to work. So now what are you going to do? People, like, it's just, you end up with generations just stuck there without much choice, right? Some people, when they will leave, but for others, leaving means risking too much, and it might not have enough money to be able to leave, and also you don't want to abandon family. But people will leave. People will leave to the north and west when they can, but not everybody ends up having that opportunity to be able to do that once they get stuck in this system. Right. So we talked about this with these are some of the highlights from the reading from chapter 5, right? This need from cadavers, need for it, and how the way this is connected to what we're talking about is how the system of slavery, how the system of racial hierarchy, this racism, ends up getting embedded. It's already embedded everywhere, and so it's just continuing on, right? Actually, let me end that because I should have a new slide for the chapter 7. That was assigned for today is a notoriously syphilis-soaked race. It's called What Really Happened at Tuskegee. So this is a very famous story, but most people don't know the story of the Tuskegee syphilis study. Who can tell us a basic rundown of what happens in with this study? This is much later. This is 1930, the 1930s and forward.
Tuskegee?
Yeah.
Oh.
What happened there with the syphilis study?
They used the Black people and gave them placebo, but to make research, and they promised that if they participated, they give a funeral. Yeah,
Yes, so that's a great start. And yeah, Ernesto, I see in the chat put, isn't this where they offered vaccines? Yeah, kind of. This goes hand in hand with that. So it's a syphilis study. So syphilis was a huge problem all over the world, right? Syphilis as a sexually transmitted disease, and it's spreading, and there's no cure for it throughout the 19th century. A lot of famous writers end up being infected with syphilis and dying of syphilis. And the thing with syphilis is that in the first couple of stages of the disease, you might not even show symptoms of it, or you might show symptoms for a short period of time, and then you can go on for years feeling great, feeling completely okay, but syphilis is slowly developing in your body, and it's waiting to resurface and kill you. Right, so it's one of these diseases that had stumped doctors beforehand. So in the 1930s, they are trying to study, right? They're developing, as we're developing new science, the U.S. Public Health Services starts a study. What they want to study is the whole progress of how syphilis develops, to see how it affects people, to see how the disease grows and transforms and eventually kills people. That doesn't sound terrible, right? If there's a disease that is doing this, then it should be studied.
But then racism hits once more.
Say that again?
Racism hits once more?
Yep. Because they decide, there was this attitude that Black men were more likely to get syphilis. They believe this. Statistically, that was not true. That was not true. There were high rates of syphilis within particular Black communities, but it was not true. There were plenty of white people who were also being affected by syphilis. But this idea that Black people were more sick and more carriers of disease because of their behavior was already embedded in American thought, right? They thought that Blacks had higher rates of disease. There was a census that had been done that showed this. A census, so when the census takers went door to door to ask, names and ages and all the census information, they also asked about sickness and disease. And what that census showed, the first census after the Civil War, showed that Black people were more likely to have a disease. People interpreted that as, aha, this shows slavery was good for Black people. These high rates of disease did not exist during slavery. Now, with freedom, Black people are not as controlled, and there's not as well taken care of, and they have gone morally corrupt. And on top of it, people saw it as a danger to the white population. Because the danger is you might contract a disease from a Black person who's sick. Well, it turns out not only was this based on very racist ideas, but the whole census and the way they collected data was off. Oftentimes when some lawmakers actually sat down, and statisticians sat down with the census information, and what they noticed was huge discrepancies in the census data. Sometimes somebody would be recorded as living somewhere where there were no people. Like they would put down a fake address and record that there were a certain number of Black people living there and that they had a disease. So basically making up people and making up people with diseases. Or sometimes what the census takers would do is just go count people, and then they would mark them down as also being sick. without actually asking them, without having any evidence of sickness. They would just mark them as sick. And so like important was this data informing people's opinions that white people thought, right? This is in 1870s, 1880s. They thought that Black people were so diseased, so sick, that eventually they would die off. They thought that Black people would become extinct in the United States by the year 2000.
Oh,
Clearly that has not happened.
mhm.
But it was all based on this bad data, bad information, but people made all kinds of racialized, racist connections to then, to make policy and to base attitudes on. So, okay, that's impacting the syphilis study, because they decide that they need to study syphilis in Black men, since that was the highest, they believe that was the highest population infected with syphilis. Again, that actually was not true, but this is the belief. And initially the intentions might have been good, but then the federal government ends up leaving the project, but researchers end up taking it over on their own without the federal government, right? So they're still going to study these Black men. So what they do is they go into a population, a Black community, and they just start testing Black men for syphilis. And any Black man that does not test positive for syphilis is not going to be part of the study, right? So they're going to test for syphilis, and any Black man that tests positive for syphilis is going to be asked to take part of the study, right? Now, they are given forms to sign in order to take part of this study. They are told that when they take part of the study, they will receive treatment. They're told they will receive treatment. You will get medication, and it's going to help you with syphilis. Now, some of you are scientists. Is this the way studies are normally done? No. One, they should be double-blind studies where a portion of those being studied are not going to be given treatment at all, right? Sometimes that's how it happens, but usually the researcher should not know who's getting the placebo and who's getting the actual medication. But anyways, already the scientific method is out the window, right? They're not following proper protocol for these studies, but they go on. Right? They decide, okay, and they tell the men, you will get treatment. Then they go to local clinics and tell doctors not to treat these men. They said, these men are taking part in a syphilis study. You are not allowed to treat them. That might not have been a huge issue initially, because again, when the study starts in 1932, that there's no successful treatment for syphilis. There's nothing they were going to be able to give people that would cure them of syphilis. But less than 10 years later, penicillin is discovered. And it discovered that if you give a syphilis patient penicillin early enough, if they're not at the last stages of syphilis, it can cure syphilis. It will cure syphilis. The researchers at the study are still telling doctors not to give patients in their study penicillin. In fact, some of the men that were in the study go to clinics specifically to get treated for their syphilis. And the researchers would go and physically remove the men from the clinics where they were actually going to be treated for syphilis. In the meantime, the researchers are giving these men placebos. They're not giving them anything. They would give them sometimes like Tylenol or something like that. So they would give them pills to take, but nothing that would actually impact the syphilis. Does this sound ethically correct?
Nope.
No, it goes against the very basics of medical ethics.
Exactly. I'm like, those of you that are scientists, this is totally unethical. It violates research protocols. It and was against the law. Goes against the law, and it's ethically not okay, and it violates all kinds of policies that researchers and doctors are supposed to follow, right? On top of it, sometimes they were really afraid of losing track of these men. So they would pay a nurse that would keep track of them. So if the men moved, she would go track them down. So basically making sure all along that they're not getting treatment for syphilis, and that they're continuing to come in every year or every so often to be examined by the researchers. Right. So what do you think happens to most of these men that took part in this study?
He died of syphilis.
Most die of syphilis. Sometimes there were some of these men that, once the study is, stopped, are able to get treatment, but most end up dying of syphilis and syphilis complications because the syphilis was too advanced. If they had been given the penicillin early, they would have been okay, but most of them end up dying and infecting their families. So a lot of these men might have been single when they went into the study, and then they got married, gave their wives syphilis. Their children might be born with syphilis. There's high rates of, if the mother has syphilis, that the child will be born with syphilis. And nobody in the family was getting treatment for the syphilis because of the way that the study was being conducted and how they would be blocked from getting the treatment. Now you might thinking, wait a minute, okay, this is not a undercover operation. It's not a secret study. This is all being done publicly. The researchers that are conducting the study would go to conferences and they would present what they were doing. Most of the people that were attended some of these conferences, after when they were asked about these presentations, couldn't remember anything. Initially, even though this was against the law when it was being conducted, initially nobody gets punished for it. In fact, they had to even raise a lot of awareness to even get the study to be stopped. There was a Black reporter who had found out about the study, realized how wrong it was and that it was illegal. And they were able to organize some people to protest against the study. But initially, nobody would listen to them. They thought it was just a small group of Black radicals trying to instigate problems. And so initially, nobody listened until the story breaks in a larger white newspaper, and And then local politicians are lobbied in order to do something. And that's when the law steps in and Congress steps in to figure out what happened here and who's responsible for it. So a committee is actually created in Congress to figure out what happened and how to try to prevent it from happening again. How many people do you think were punished for this study? Guess? Anybody want to guess what kind of punishment there was? What would you expect if this happened? Yeah,
Probably none.
probably none. Yeah. There were some political repercussions. There was one Black doctor who ended up not being able to serve in federal office because he had attended one of the conferences where the information was presented about the syphilis study. So he had not connected at all, except that somebody said he was at a conference where he might have heard about the study.
Yeah.
The nurse that would track the men, she ends up being kind of held responsible by a lot of people. Like she's not able to work afterwards, and there's a lot of backlash for the Black nurse that tracked these men. But of the doctors, the researchers that conducted the study, nothing happens. When the congressional committee was interviewing them all of these people, they recorded the interviews with all the researchers that took part. And then at the end when they filed the report, they destroyed all the recordings. So we actually don't even have any of that evidence anymore. So, and this was a widespread, right? This wasn't just a handful of men that took part in this study. This was a significant study. So Alex, yes, Alex in the chat says, so basically just the people of color that helped along the way got in trouble. Yeah. And not that they didn't have any responsibility, but the people in charge should have been the ones who should have been held responsible. There should have been jail time. They should have lost their medical licenses, right? Like these researchers went on to work and work in other studies and continue with their medical practices if they had them. Like they treated patients after this. Would you want to be treated by one of those doctors?
No, not at all.
Right? I'm like,
No way. Professor.
Yeah.
But when the journalist discovered, he put on the evidence, the families received something or not?
Oh, they did get sued in their, I think I'll have to look it up again. I think I don't think the families received anything.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the congressional report did say that they found that the study was ethically unjustifiable. But that was the extent of anything. Part of the issue was a lot of these men had already died by the time some of this information came out. And so that was part of it. I'll look up and see if anybody ended up getting anything, but I don't think they got anything for it. But there was a lot of trust then lost, right? Especially in this community where the syphilis study takes part. People remembered the children, the grandchildren, like the families remembered for generations that this had been done. There were even rumors, like the story ended up snowballing in all kinds of weird ways. There were rumors that the men had been intentionally injected with syphilis, and there's no evidence of that, but I can understand why the community would think that. And I'm like, oh, kind of, it was a version of that, but nobody was injected with syphilis, but they were allowed to be infected by it. There were some men that had initially tested negative for syphilis, and then years later would test positive for syphilis. And they would just be moved from the control group to the group being studied. Which was, again, also not proper protocols and extremely unethical, just all kinds of wrong things happening there. And this will connect to what we're going to talk about next week, right? About how we conduct medical studies today. Because one, remember, this is the syphilis study is in the 1930s, it begins, but the study continued until the 1970s. And what the documentary you're going to watch next week is going to show, that experimentation, illegal experimentations, have continued to be conducted in the United States, and it has primarily affected Black and minority populations. There's ways in which researchers have been able to get away with conducting studies as late as like the early 2000s that we know of. And to me, I'm like, it's especially relevant in a moment in which we're dealing with a global pandemic and we're seeing a lot of resistance to things like vaccines and medical intervention, right? And again, that's not the case with everybody who's like, this is not taking into account anti-vaxxers or people who are refusing to take vaccines for political reasons or other reasons, but it explains how much work the medical field has when it comes to community outreach and earning the trust of certain communities, because all the trust has been gone in a lot of communities, and we'll talk about it. It's not just the Black community. We'll talk about what happened to Latina women in California, Indigenous women in reservation hospitals. This has happened more times than a lot of us like to think of. But okay. I'm going to stop here and just make one announcement. I'm like, before you all go log off, wait. Next week, we're not meeting on Monday, but I'm asking you all to watch that documentary, Belly of the Beast, right? It's linked. Let me share my screen so I can show you. It's linked on Canvas under week 8. Let me pull it up. Okay. So if you go to modules week 8, it is linked here. Watch on Monday. So we won't meet on Monday, but we will meet on Wednesday to talk about the documentary. The documentary is a little over an hour long, not much. And so it's something that you can even watch over the weekend if you have time. But if not, that's why I'm canceling class on Monday, so that at the very least you have that time in which you can watch the documentary. I will send out a reminder of that. And you have the discussion board post due Sunday. So don't forget the discussion board post due Sunday, and then watch the documentary by the time we meet on Wednesday. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll stop the recording now.